Okay. We are on.
Good afternoon. We are so excited. We are so excited. We are so excited to see each and every one of you here on today for our Bible study, our Tuesday 12 noon Bible study. We're excited because we have a special topic that we are going to be highlighting on today. Our special topic is all about violence and trauma. And how do we care for ourselves in the midst of violence and trauma that we experience, as well as how do we care for our fellow brothers and sisters who have experienced violence and trauma? What do we say? What do we do to support them during this time? And so the particular biblical story that we are focusing on is Hagar. That is the particular biblical story that we are focusing on. Now, I don't have to tell you wonderful biblical scholars all about Hagar and her plight, do I? Because you come to Bible study and you come to Sunday worship. So you already know this story. So I'm just going to gently, gracefully breeze over a couple of important details. You remember Hagar. Hagar is the maid servant of Sarah. You know, Sarah and her dear husband, Abraham, happen to be who we credit as the father and mother, or mother and father of our faith. They are wrestling with infertility. They are struggling because they remember a promise. They remember a promise that God had made to them, that they would bear a child. But ironically, they're still waiting. God's promise has not been fulfilled in their life yet. And so they decide to take matters in their own hands. You remember one of the points that we highlighted on last week was the importance of remembering the ways in which sometimes we struggle with troubling circumstances because we take matters into our own hands. Instead of being patient and waiting, we decide to help God out a little bit and do some things to move things along. And sometimes it's not in God's will for us to do that. And so one lesson that we take away from this text is the importance of embracing patience. Patience, patience, patience is so hard. Why was it hard for Sarah and Abraham to exercise patience? It was hard because first and foremost, they were used to receiving external validation from the outside world. Let's land the plane here just for a second. In psychology and human development, we believe that there are persons who live their lives in such a way where they look for external validation from other people, external validation to make them have a higher sense of self-esteem, external validation to somehow make them feel good and secure about their present life paths, calls, missions, or purposes. And so we discover that if one does not have an internal self-affirmation, one will then seek to receive validation from an external world and society. And that is problematic. Instead of Sarah and Abraham resting in the faith that God would certainly be true to God's promises, Sarah and Abraham began to compare themselves to other gentlemen and ladies, moms, dads, brothers and sisters, who they experienced around them having children, becoming pregnant, experiencing childbirth, and now having someone to carry on their name. And so Abraham and Sarah discover let me take matters into my own hands to help God along with creating a child, because they struggle as they look to their left, they look to their right, comparing themselves to others. You know, let's pause for a second. Comparing ourselves to other people is a surefire way to get ourselves in trouble. We wrestle with low self-esteem around what we have, because sometimes we compare what we have to what other people have. So then we create what's called a cognitive distortion. What is a cognitive distortion? Please Google this term. A cognitive distortion says that my mind plays tricks on me. A hip hop group in the early 1990s called the Ghetto Boys came out with this glaring, wonderful, psychological rap song and video called "My Mind is Playing Tricks on Me." I pretend to see things that don't exist. I begin to imagine things that are not real. And one type of cognitive distortion is called minimalization and magnification. In some sense, Abraham and Sarah began to minimize the fact that God's promise is minute, is small, is meaningless, doesn't have value. So therefore, we need to help God along. And they begin to magnify what they begin to see to their left and to their right. All of these people having children, and here we are still waiting to have a child, waiting for God to answer our prayers. And so another lesson for us is, how do we resist the urge to minimalize all of the gifts, skills, and talents we have in our life? How do we resist the urge to magnify what we see other people having? And resist the urge to compare. Don't compare what we think is something minor, minuscule in our lives to what we think is something huge, big, gigantic in somebody else's life. And so we talked about last week how our sister and our brother Abraham and Sarah take matters into their own hands and turn to Hagar to say, let us create a child with Hagar. This was, just for all of those who would like me to connect the dots, this was the first ever biblical entanglement. You heard a few months ago, Jada Pinkett and Will Smith and August Alsina talk about an entanglement that the three of them became involved in. Jada Pinkett Smith says, I became, even though I'm married to Will Smith, entangled and started an entanglement with August Alsina. And we scratched our head and said, this is the first time we've ever seen anything like this. And I ventured to say, no. Entanglements have been happening since biblical days. We find ourselves looking at this Hagar, Abraham, Sarah relationship as an entanglement in the similar ways that later in the biblical text, Jacob, Rachel, and Leah will have an entanglement yet again. The challenge for us today, though, is that these entanglements create trauma and lead to violence. Let's pause for a second before we unpack this particular statement, that these type of relationships can cause trauma and violence. I'll pause for a second before I get too far along. Pastor Jackson, did you want to jump in and add anything?
That point, that point about the biblical entanglement is so profound. I borrowed a statement from the late Dr. Frederick G. Sampson, who said, the Bible actually anticipates us. And in many ways, things that we experience, we think, like you just said, this first time, Will Smith and Jada, they start talking about this, it was like new, but it's really not new, that the scriptures, the scriptures have already, revealed that folk was entangling, a long time ago in some very messy entanglements. And I'm glad you're bringing out the trauma that is raised, because we really look at the scriptures really high spiritual, that, we're talking about faith, and that's true, but let's not miss the mess that that was created by some of the, rushing to do things because, we just want it, just what we want. I want it. Why can't I have it? So yeah, I'll leave it alone and sit back and enjoy as you continue with this. This is awesome.
Yes, yes, yes. Yes, 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 yes. And so there's a number of traumas that exist in this text. Now, we're going to focus on the trauma of Hagar, but I'd like to also talk about the other traumas in this text briefly for a second. There's the trauma that Abraham experiences. You're saying to yourself, Big Yo, what trauma did Abraham experience? In a patriarchal society, as Pastor Jackson will highlight last week, it was traumatic for Abraham, who is male, who is husband. It was a trauma that he experiences in the public eye of not having a child and seemingly feeling less than, because in biblical days, in the place and space of patriarchy, runs now a thread of you must not be man enough, or you are not validated in your maleness because you cannot produce children. It's important to note in biblical days, the idea that one could or could not produce children spoke to, in some sense, two pressing dynamics. The first dynamic was it spoke to their own sense of humanness around if they could be considered a good man, a qualified man, a man that should ascribe or have ascribed to him the value of patriarchy. If one could not produce children and they were male, the larger society would look down on them and they'll attack their humanness, their maleness, their being. Number two, the ability to produce children also symbolized someone's connection with the divine. I want to pause for a second and talk the theological impact of one not being able to experience childbirth. There are three dynamics in this. When one could not experience childbirth, one was considered having an illness or crisis in biblical days. Today, the technical term we ascribe to it is infertility. Now, when one would experience infertility in biblical days, or infertility, I say, even today, there are certain theological meanings that are attached to this. First, there's a belief that one is sick and in crisis and experiencing infertility because, first and foremost, they have sinned against God. First and foremost, they have sinned against God. Please, 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 beloved, I hope you have pen and paper handy. There is a belief that they have sinned against God, and that's why they are not able to bear children. So oftentimes we saw in biblical days, when one wrestled with infertility, one theological thought or belief system that one person held to, that a person held to if they could not bear children, was that God was punishing them for their sin. So if you can remember the prayer of Hannah before she gave birth to beloved Samuel, the prayer of Hannah was, Lord, if I have done anything against your name, please forgive me. In that prayer, she is psychologically stating that she believes she cannot bear children because she has sinned against God. And so Sarah and Abraham, and we're starting with Abraham first, primarily wrestled with this belief as well. Number two, there's a second psychology that's attached to illness and crisis, and in particular, not being able to bear children. And that belief system is that somehow God is testing me, that I am being tested, You can remember our dear brother Job. You can remember the story of Job, where the devil happens to be walking the earth. And God says, devil, what are you doing? And the devil says, I'm looking for somebody to tempt. And God says, well, have you considered my servant Job? From this belief system, that as an example, there are many people who believe crisis and tests in life and the ability to not bear children or be unable to bear children is in some sense a test from God. And so Abraham, number two, struggled with, God, why are you testing me? So God, you must think I have sinned, number one. And number two, God, you want to test me. The third psychological belief about infertility that many persons who are who wrestle with infertility struggle with today, both in biblical days and today, mind you, is the fact that God is just indifferent, that God is nowhere around, that God is nowhere near, that God does not hear the cries of parents who yearn for the gift of children and bearing children. And so in some sense, this is the third psychological belief system that Abraham wrestled with. God, you're nowhere around. So you made this promise to my wife and I, but God, you must be punishing us. You made this promise to us, but God, you must be testing us. You made this promise to us, but God, thirdly, you must be far away. You're not close at hand. You're not telling the truth. You're indifferent to us. What do we say to people who wrestle with infertility today? Or what do we say to persons who have some sort of illness or health condition? We say, no, God is with you during this time. God is not punishing you. You didn't do anything wrong. God is not testing you. God is not looking at you as some wager or pawn in a bet with the devil. And number three, God is not indifferent. God is not far removed from your circumstance. God is not somewhere far off, far removed from your circumstance. And so we have to remind people of that. And I wish there would have been someone to remind Abraham that God is with him during this time and to hold on to the promise of God. The irony of this text is also something else. We forget. We suffer from amnesia. What do I mean by that? When we experience trauma because of these three psychological beliefs, trauma causes us to experience amnesia and forget. That is one facet of trauma. That's a symptom. That's a symptom of trauma, is that we wrestle with amnesia. We forget all of the good in our life. We forget all of the blessings. We forget all of the things that God has done for us in our life that have been wonderful. How did Abraham experience amnesia? First, we say Abraham experienced amnesia because he forgot. It was his ancestors who were da. It was his ancestors who were the children of Israel. It was his ancestors who were brought out of bondage. And why is it Abraham seems to forget that? Abraham seems to forget everything that God has done for his ancestors. That's what trauma does. Trauma seems to, in some sense, trauma seems to push us away from remembering the same God who had been with us, our ancestors. When I say us, I mean our ancestors, is the same God who is with us today. But when we experience trauma, again, when we believe that we are being punished for sin, when we believe that we are being tested as pawns and wagers in a bet, when we believe that God is indifferent to us, then a symptom is we forget. We forget that the same God who has been with our ancestors and saw our ancestors through is the same God who is with us today. And so even though God makes a promise to Abraham and Sarah that I will give you a child to bear, Abraham and Sarah seem to forget. This is the same God who also promised Moses that if you go to Pharaoh and declare to him, let my people go, I will give them liberation. As a people of African descent, we wrestle sometimes with amnesia too. Today, in 2021, even though God tells us to never fear principalities and spiritual wickedness in high places, we do. We forget all that God has brought our ancestors through. Because the trauma that we experience today, meaning, here we go again, let's repeat it, family. The trauma we experience today that causes us to believe we are being punished, believe we are being tested, believe God is indifferent to us. It causes us to forget what God did for our African ancestors. So you mean to tell me someone down in our ancestry line survived being chained to other human bodies for several months in the bottom of a disease-infested ship during the Middle Passage, lost their language, customs, and traditions, picked up the English language as best they could while working free of charge from sun up to sundown as they watched their babies sold from out of their arms and women raped by ruthless slave owners, took names with no last names, no birth certificates, no heritage of any kind, braved the Underground Railroad, survived the Civil War to enter into sharecropping, then had to learn to read and write without sheer will and determination, faced with burning crosses of the KKK, averted their eyes at the black bodies swinging from ropes hung on trees, fought in world wars as soldiers only to return to America as boys, marched in Birmingham, were hosed in Selma, jailed in Wilmington, assassinated in Memphis, segregated in the South, ghettoed in the North, ignored in history books, stereotyped in Hollywood, and in spite of all, someone in our family line endured every error to make sure you got here, but you received one rejection, face one obstacle, lose one friend, get overlooked, and now you want to quit and say, God is testing me, God is punishing me, God doesn't care about my plot. No, 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 no. God is with us. And so we have to resist the temptation to have amnesia and forget all that God has brought us, meaning our African ancestors, through. And remember, the same God that was with Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Denmark Vesey, Marcus Garvey, is the same God that's with us today, brothers and sisters. And somehow my sadness in this Abraham, Sarah, Hagar entanglement is that Abraham forgot and Sarah forgot all that God had done for them, his ancestors, as told in Exodus 3. And so how do we begin to remember the stories of our ancestors and how much that they have given to us? When it seems as if we want to believe that God's promises won't come to pass, how do we remember the promises that God made to our ancestors? And remain faithful and patient and vigilant to holding to God's unchanging hand and holding on to the promises of God as an act of faith. Trauma tells us to forget, but our African-centered psychology, our African-centered theology tells us to remember the oral traditions that have been passed down to us and drop our anchors there. I'll pause for a second, Pastor Jackson. I think you're on muted.
Okay, yeah. You gave me something that I had not realized actually happens in trauma, and that is this forgetting. And when you brought it up, then it became clear about, people going through trauma forget whatever benefits, whatever whatever support and comfort. Trauma makes you isolate yourself. It makes you feel like I'm the only one going through, and there's nobody that is thinking about me, that cares about me, that wants to help me. There's just nobody that will stand up for me. And so we forget all of the people that have been there before. We forget all of the people that have helped us along the way. I mean, in real time. And then it's so profound. We forget that as we honor and think of our grandparents and how loving and whatnot they are, we forget that they came through some horrific things. And in fact, we forget that God has brought many of our ancestors through a much more arduous trial than we are dealing with. And so the same God that got them through that can get us through now somebody not speaking to us, or somebody that is hating on us, or situations that come up that could be much worse. In fact, while you were talking, it made me think of Lovecraft Country, when the elder sister was talking to the young lady, and the young lady was from the future, went back into time, and she was going to go back. She was pregnant, and the elder mother says, that baby in your womb will be my faith turned to flesh. And we are the faith of some ancestors, some elder. We are their faith turned to flesh, which means they are saying the same God that got me through will get you through. And so in this story, you're so right, because Abraham and Sarah are they are in their late stages of life. They're in their 80s. During this time, people didn't normally live that long. This is not the Methuselah time. And only by God's grace were they able to live this long and have what they had. They didn't have a child, and that is traumatic. But they forgot how God had been taking care of. So when God gives them a promise, oh yeah, you're gonna have a baby, it's like, I forgot, what God has already done. So I mean, you are working that thing. And thank you for sending me. I was gonna ask you to send me what you read. I was like, I've got to use that. So look at God. God got our minds together. So yeah, that's it. I mean, this is good. This is real good.
And let me say,
oh, you good now?
Let me also say that Sarah. Now let's turn to Sarah. Sarah also experiences trauma because there's so much pressure on her as woman, as female, the one who bears the child. There's so much pressure on her to have a child as well. She is looked at as damaged goods in the larger society. She is looked at as worthless, as invaluable. A woman, just like today, who was unable to bear children, struggles with her womanness, struggles with external validation from the larger society. And so, ironically enough, she still wrestles with those same 3 psychological belief systems that are impacted by theology as well, that Abraham struggled with. Maybe God is punishing me. Maybe God is testing me. Maybe God is indifferent to my plight and is far removed from me as well. And so both of them are wrestling with this trauma and decide to take it into their own hands. Now for this week, thank you, audience, for allowing me to expound a little bit more on last week. This week now, we're talking about the trauma of Hagar. How many people know that hurt people hurt people? Abraham and Sarah are hurt. Abraham and Sarah are hurt. So what do? They then turn around and hurt another being. They hurt another being. Hurt people hurt people. That's a common phrase that we hear today, but let's apply it to this biblical text. Because of the 3 traumatic psychological thoughts that Abraham and Sarah are experiencing, they then hurt another person, causing further trauma. That is the viciousness of trauma. Trauma becomes intergenerational. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, but Danielle, technically, Sarah and Abraham were not related to Hagar. Yes, we know that. But at the same time, the biblical text tells us that Hagar looked to Sarah as similar to a mother figure, similar to our African tradition today, even though we may not be biologically related to each other, we still may look at our elders as mom and dad. That's why we tend to turn to our elders and sometimes say, hey, mom, hey, dad, even if they're not our biological mom and dad. And so if that is the case, then psychologists reading this text have said that trauma becomes intergenerational in this Sarah, Abraham, Hagar entanglement, because Sarah and Abraham pass on their trauma to Hagar. The term for this is called epigenetics. Please look this term up, epigenetics. Epigenetics is this understanding that you can pass trauma down from generation to generation. So if you've experienced trauma today, epigenetics says you pass that trauma down. Let me give you an example. As people of African descent who had to experience the trauma of African enslavement, we wonder now why, watch this. We wonder now why some of us are violent people, and violence is a way of life for many of us. Epigenetics says because we experienced violence August 20th, 1619 to June 19th, 1865. We experienced violence during that time period again, August 20th, 1619 to June 19th, 1865. That was the time of African enslavement. We now pass on this trauma to future generations, even into 2020, 2021. So the first ships carrying enslaved African bodies from South Africa arrived to these United States of America on August 20th, 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. And we were enslaved from August 20th, 1619 to June 19th, 1865 in Galveston, Texas. That was the space and place in the last day of African enslavement. We now have passed down those years of trauma to us. So let me give an example. The ways in which we decide to spank our children. We physically beat our children as a form of discipline. Why do we do that? We do that because we were physically beat in the hopes of being disciplined by European racist white slave masters. So now we pass this trauma on to our children by physically beating our children. And then they grow up and they have children and they physically beat their children. And then they grow up and they have children and they physically beat their children. We pass this trauma of physical beatings and physical discipline to our children. That is what we call epigenetics. And so Abraham and Sarah passed down this trauma to Hagar. And our text says, as Hagar's stomach begins to protrude, showing now that she is pregnant by Abraham, because Abraham had a sexual encounter with Hagar. Now her stomach is starting to protrude. And it is seeing this that causes Hagar to experience a physical beating from Sarah. Sarah sees this stomach growing larger and larger. And that in itself becomes a trauma to Sarah. Most people don't understand. It is the act of seeing Hagar's stomach become larger and larger and larger that causes Sarah trauma. And so Sarah responds with violence. Many trauma therapists look at this biblical text and say, you can experience trauma by what you see. And this is an example of what occurred to Sarah. Sarah becomes traumatized by seeing a violent image. Now I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, but Danielle, what was the violent image? It was just Hagar growing in her pregnancy. How was that violent? Biblical psychologists say it was violent in two ways. Number one, it's violence or it's traumatic in two ways. One, Hagar's protruding stomach, growing stomach is another sign, message to Sarah of what you cannot do. Again, you cannot have a child. So this growing stomach becomes a trauma because of Sarah being able to see it. Number two, it's a trauma because Sarah now has to come face to face with the reality that my husband was not faithful to me and me only. Even though I thought of this idea, I recommended it, the text says. It is now a reminder of, wow, he actually did it. He created this being. And watch this now. It's a trauma to Sarah in a third way. Please watch this, family. I now maybe had to admit that if Abraham got Hagar pregnant, it ain't nothing wrong with him. Oh, if we were sitting at a restaurant, I could use the language I want to use. But for the sake of this being a church Bible study, Sarah now has to be reminded that there was nothing wrong with Abraham's, what's the word, Pastor Jackson? There's nothing wrong with Abraham's
His plumbing was working.
Thank you. His plumbing was working. His plumbing was working. And so now that becomes a third trauma for Sarah. She has to now admit to herself and wrestle with low self-esteem around, it must be me because he's fine. Hagar's growing stomach is evidence that everything is fine with him and he's working. And so this becomes a third trauma. Beloved, another lesson that this text teaches us in light of what biblical scholars and psychologists say is important is the ways in which we become traumatized by what we see. Sarah becomes traumatized by what she sees. And so in some sense, we have to be reminded to be careful what you watch. We live in a land of social media and 24-hour news coverage. Pastor Jackson and I were talking about this on Sunday. We live in a society that now has the news playing 24/7, and the news can become demoralizing and depressing. I am a huge fan of CNN, and I had to be so careful because I could just sit and watch CNN 24/7, 24/7, 24/7, because I don't believe in watching reality television shows because I have a problem with brothers and sisters looking like animals for white media execs. I tend to just stay primarily on news, but that can become depressing to me. I can become traumatized by what I see, looking at social media today, watching violence that goes viral on social media. You can become traumatized by what you see. And so this text reminds us, Sarah becomes traumatized by what she sees, this growing stomach of Hagar. And as a result, one result of trauma is violence. People will become violent when they experience trauma. And so Sarah becomes violent with Hagar, and Sarah physically attacks Hagar. She physically attacks Hagar. She beats Hagar up. She assaults Hagar in a very vicious way. This text reminds us to think about, oftentimes when we think about domestic violence, we think about scenarios where it is male as perpetrator, female as victim. This text reminds us that domestic violence can happen in a multitude of familial relationships. It can even happen with mother or mother figure being violent to daughter or daughter figure. And so in some sense, Sarah commits an act of domestic violence to Hagar. October, and we'll talk about this more on Tuesdays at 12 noon during the month of October, but October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And we're going to talk about, oftentimes when we talk about domestic violence, we talk about male as perpetrator, female as victim. We're going to talk about other forms of domestic violence because sometimes our brothers get a bad rap. This text reminds us to think about violence and trauma now that Sarah enacts on Hagar because trauma begets violence. People who experience trauma then cause trauma to other people in the form of violence. And so Sarah commits violence towards Hagar, and Hagar runs out into the wilderness. Hagar runs out to the wilderness and has a wilderness experience. Hagar runs out into the wilderness and has a wilderness experience. How many traumas do you think Hagar has experienced? Have you ever asked yourself that? Let's count them out. First, she is an enslaved handmaiden. No one has ever asked the question. Womanist scholars such as Will Gaffney in her wonderful book called Womanist Midrash said, we have to remember Hagar experienced one trauma and that she is no longer in her home with her family. She is now taken. I don't know what fancy language, it doesn't matter what fancy language you want to use. She is taken, she is kidnapped. She is enslaved as a handmaid now. And remember, Hagar's not grown. Hagar is young. Hagar's a young girl. Some texts say she's about 16 years old. She's a teenage girl. She's not an adult. She is enslaved as a handmaiden. Can you believe the mother and father of our Christian faith, also enslaved someone? Wow, what does it mean theologically for us to know that Abraham, the father of our faith, Sarah, the mother of our faith, were the same couple who had oppressed this young girl, this young baby girl. She experiences one trauma in that way. Number two, she experiences a trauma in that. I'm trying to keep this as clean as possible for Sunday at 12 noon. Do you think she gave consent to have a sexual relationship with Abraham? Could she have said no? So there are some womanist scholars who say Abraham raped Hagar because there was no way, especially in this biblical day of patriarchy, male dominance, where you now are submissive as the hand servant or maid servant to Sarah. There's no way she could have said no. Remember, I told you she's 16 years old also, and how old is Abraham? Abraham was a zaddy in biblical days. And so, in some sense, there's some womanist scholars who say this was rape because there's no way Hagar could have been able to give a mutual consent to this encounter. So this becomes the second trauma she experiences. What is the third trauma? The third trauma, some say, is the fact that she got pregnant. What does it mean when someone has experienced rape and now they become pregnant by their rapist? I wonder what would have been Hagar's plight if she was living in Texas today. Last week, Texas recently came out with a law. Let's talk current events now, family. Texas recently came out with the abortion ban law that says you cannot have an abortion. Your body is not owned by you. Well, we have allowed Hagar to get an abortion. If she was living today in a great state of Texas, we would have said no. Hagar would have had to bear the baby in the same way that Sarah and Abraham in biblical days could have forced Hagar to bear this baby. So this is another trauma. This is another trauma that Hagar experiences, having to bear the child of her attacker. And the same way in which, watch this, Sarah is traumatized by having to visually look at this growing stomach of Hagar. It's the same way I contend Hagar is traumatized by looking at her own body expand, knowing that she is carrying inside of her the life of Abraham. And Hagar experiences another trauma. She is beat now by her mother elder, the one that is supposed to care for her, love her, nurture her. You know what the mother is supposed to provide. Sarah is supposed to be her surrogate mother, if you will, the one who is supposed to love her, nurture her, take care of her. This one beats her. Think about the dynamics of that. The one that's supposed to provide nurture. We understand in African-centered psychology and theology that our mother is the one that provides nurture. What does it mean that the one that provides nurture really now provides violence? And so Hagar experiences a trauma in that way as well. So I count 4. I hope my count is right. 1, taken from her land, forced to work as an indentured servant. 2, not being able to give visual consent to if she even wanted to have sexual relations with Abraham. 3, becoming pregnant, having to look at her stomach and visually see this physical being that represents now the second trauma all over again. And 4, then experiencing physical abuse. So not only suffering sexual assault, but now physical assault by her mother figure in the community. Hagar runs into the wilderness. Some even say that is the 5th trauma. Being pregnant, isolated, alone in a wilderness moment is the fifth trauma Hagar experiences. And so our text says that as she is crying, grieving, the spirit angel comes and says, go back home. This is a hard text. Go back home to these four traumas. Go back home to these four traumas, these four traumas. In some sense, how we have made sense of this text is by simply saying that it would have been more traumatic for this pregnant teenage girl to stay in a wilderness without any food, any water. And so we are reminded, what are the ways in which we have to care for our pregnant sisters among us in our community today. Republicans are just interested in whether or not you should bear a baby, and most of the time they land on, yes, you should. Abortion should not be allowed. But they're never concerned about the life of the baby afterwards. How this baby may live in poverty and grow up in poverty, unemployment, underemployment, homelessness, hunger, food insecurity. And so maybe in God's own omnipotent, omnipresent imagination, maybe the Spirit of the Lord, this angel, is wanting Sarah to return home, according to womanist theologians, where at least she can be in an environment where a baby will be cared for, and she's not in a wilderness experience. And so we have to begin to reflectively, and this is the last point, and then we'll go for any discussions or questions on our social media pages. We have to begin to also reflect on how are we supporting all young ladies like Hagar that exist in our communities today? Are we being a Sarah, being abusive, taking advantage, hurting our children, or are we being supportive? Are we being an angel, a loving presence, a nurturing presence that provides social service resources to all of the Hagars that exist in our community today? How is God calling you to be the very angel that spoke to Hagar? Be that angel presence to provide social support and resources to all of the Hagars that exist in our community today. Not telling them to settle and go back and deal with trauma, but more so giving them the support they need as they bear children, providing them with social service resources that could be helpful for them during difficult, troubling times. How do we also be sensitive to the trauma that these young ladies have experienced in their life? There's so many traumas that our African-American young girls experience. How are we sensitive to that? Just like we have to learn to be sensitive to and acknowledge and become self-aware about the traumas that Hagar experienced in this text, we also have to be sensitive to the ways in which our young ladies today experience trauma. What I think is amazing in this text, September is Suicide Awareness Prevention Month. There are so many young people that are wrestling with suicide today. I am amazed at Hagar's resiliency. That's what we say as a form of recovery from trauma in the psychological world. We say resiliency becomes key. We celebrate Hagar because she was resilient. She didn't commit suicide. She didn't attempt suicide. She didn't commit suicide. Even though she was sad, depressed, on the edge, on the margins, depleted, she picked herself up and she became resilient by going back home. So the last and final reflection for us is, what are the pathways to resiliency that we can promote in our communities where people experience trauma? Google this term, trauma and resiliency. If you were to Google that term, trauma and resiliency, there are a number of strategies and interventions that you can incorporate. Maybe you yourself are experiencing trauma. What are the ways in which you need to practice strategies and interventions around resiliency? Resiliency is a cool, healthy, wonderful way of how we are to respond to trauma by becoming resilient, by getting back up and reestablishing home, safety, and security for ourselves. Thank you. Pastor Jackson, any thoughts from our audience or from you?
Yeah, I want to read a couple of things on the chat. Diane points out that one of the things she said that touches her heart deeply. This is what you're talking about. One of the things that touches her heart deeply because she worked in a prenatal care place and would see young girls, even at the age of 11 years old, who were pregnant and dealing with feelings of anger, frustration, not understanding what was going on with their bodies and what was going on inside of them. And she says it was traumatizing. Jeanette points out, it makes you think about women who go back to or stay in domestic violence situations. Mike Carson said, I just started to realize that I've wrestled with fear all my life. It has had profound effect on my psyche. So those were just some of, there are a few others, but those were some of the responses that people lifted up. You know.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I know that this is a heavy text.
Yeah.
And so I want us to leave on this reflective note around how can we promote resiliency for ourselves. COVID-19 is a whole traumatic event.
Mm-hmm.
We need to promote resiliency. Every time I turn around, I'm having someone say, man, I don't feel like myself. I ain't felt like myself since COVID-19 hit. And I have to admit, if I'm honest with myself, if I could be vulnerable on this internet line without anybody laughing at me, I've felt some kind of way too since COVID hit. I have a deep sense of sadness since COVID hit. And so we all have to figure out, how do we practice resiliency? How do we practice resiliency for the trauma that we are all faced with today? And I just mentioned one pandemic of COVID-19. I haven't mentioned the second pandemic that was hitting us before COVID-19, the pandemic of police brutality, the pandemic of racism, the pandemic of poverty, the pandemic of all these other pandemics that we've been wrestling with since 1865, technically. So a reflective question for us becomes, how do we practice resiliency? How do we all practice resiliency in the midst of these traumas as a result of these pandemics that we've been living in for years? What does resiliency look like for us?
Right.
Resiliency may look like going to see a mental health therapist. www.blacktherapistrock.com. www.blacktherapistrock.com. www.therapyforblackmen.org. www.therapyforblackmen.org. www.therapyforblackgirls.com. www.therapyforblackgirls.com. Please go to these websites. They give us wonderful resources for resiliency today.
Yeah, thank you for that, because I have experienced persons who can identify other people that need to go to a therapist, but they can't see themselves going to a therapist. I'm telling you, I've literally talked to, even in the past month, a few people, several people, and they were talking about somebody else they knew that, they wish they would get help, wish they'd go, a therapist and whatnot. And I said, well, what about you? Because you're carrying a lot of stuff. I don't know, I'm not, I probably should, but yeah, I'm like, it is, you go to a doctor, a MD, because something in the metabolism in the body is not functioning the way it probably should. You go to a dentist because, things, in the dental area are not going right. You go to an ophthalmologist because, like me, you got to have vision corrected. You go to a therapist because processing the traumas and the changes in life, it's hard to process them on your own. It's okay. It's okay. I have a therapist, and had a therapist for years now. It is okay. It's not a sign of weakness that you can't handle stuff. It means that you are handling stuff. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well.
So wait till our lesson next week. Our lesson next week. Ishmael. Now, the trauma of the pregnant baby of Hagar. Ishmael. We're going to continue the story and talk now about this baby named Ishmael.
Wow.
Now the trauma that he experiences.
Absolutely. Right? Cannot wait.
All right.
So thank you all who are on the chat line. I see a bunch of comments, and thank you so much, Diane and Jeanette and Mike and Robert Gordon and all those who are on that I can't see. I know you're there. There are folk that are on, and they don't have to show up. So I know you're there, and thank you for being on. And thank you once again, Dr. Buhuro, for this midday ministry.
Awesome.
We look forward to next week.
Thank you.
All right.